Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome again, once more, to the Center for Presidential History and Dedman College, back to the Hilltop for our series on presidential history and biography. I want to impress upon you how grateful we are that you all decided to recognize that history is more important than NCAA basketball, especially, unfortunately, since SMU is not in this year. But since SMU is not in this year, I just would like to remind you that Wisconsin plays tomorrow at 4. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a moment. Thank you for coming out tonight. We have, this is another one of our series of presidents, and this one with a Texas flair. And this speaker tonight gives me particular pleasure to introduce, so much so that I'm going to delay the satisfaction for a moment to talk about something else, which is this book. Now, you may not be able to see in the back. This is a copy of To End All Wars, Woodrow Wilson and the Quest for a New World Order, which has just been printed by Princeton University Press as a 25th anniversary edition, because it is among the most monumental and influential and fascinating and well-researched and well-written books of all about Woodrow Wilson. And I will tell you that I've said that well before I met Professor Tom Nock, who wrote the book. There he is. So if you would, yeah, please. It's really a profoundly monumental thing in a scholar's career to have someone think enough of your work to publish it again. So copies are available with a new preface bringing Woodrow Wilson scholarship up to date. I encourage you to take a look at it because it's really, really worth your time. What's also worth your time is our speaker tonight, Kyle Longley, who is the Snell Family Professor from Arizona State University. Kyle is, without exaggeration, one of those people that if I spent time reading to you his list of accomplishments and, more importantly, his list of publications, you would not have time to hear him. So trust me, there are a lot of them. I want to highlight two in particular. The first is, this is actually the first 2020 publication I've ever had in my hand. In Harm's Way, it's a brand new military history textbook. Feel free to go on Amazon and get it, but I assure you that if you know a student who takes military history within the next 10 years, they are going to be reading this book. So you can go to that student and say, you heard it first. And secondly, the other book that we're here to discuss tonight is, of course, LBJ's 1968. LBJ, of course, needs no introduction for this crowd. One of the most pivotal years in American history, one of the most pivotal presidents, and no one, I think, has done a better job, in my opinion, to really synthesize down how important that moment and that person was to the entire era of America's post-war experience than Kyle. Now, I do have to tell you, he has a severe mental deficiency. He went to the University of Kentucky. So they are playing now, right now. So his brain is going to be in several places. So if you ask questions, speak slowly. But besides that, please join me in welcoming my good friend, Kyle Longley.
Well, it's so great to be here tonight. I have to admit, I am going to miss UK basketball, and as my wife will tell you, that is a serious offense. She remembers a few years ago when Kentucky was playing in the national title, and they scored to win, and I jumped up and I caught my knee on the side of a piece of wood, and I started bleeding, but I wouldn't stop. I called my best friend, and we celebrated. So she was sitting there dabbing my knee as I was celebrating, so that's how serious. But it can be sort of a disease of derangement, might be a good way to put it. But I'm so happy to be here tonight. I so appreciate Jeff's invitation. I'm a native Texan, so it's always good to be here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area where I have many friends and family. My father finished one of his last coaching jobs here in the Arlington area. So I just have a special place in my heart here and, look forward to coming back many, many more times. So tonight what I'm going to talk about is LBJ in 1968. Now there are multiple biographies. In fact, Robert Kairos will be at the LBJ Library on April 14th, I believe. But he's not coming to talk about the new volume. He's coming to talk about a book that talks about how he did the research for all his books. So I keep wanting to ask him, but I'm afraid to, are you ever going to finish the next volume? Because that was a question asked of me by my publishers. Why are you going to publish a book on LBJ in 1968? Cairo's going to come along and write the definitive work of all time. And I said, well, I think I can beat him. I can get it out first. And so I did. So we're still waiting on that. I think he's up to 1966. That's what I've been told. But I just want to talk about this one particular. And what I'm going to do tonight is just sort of give you a brief overview of the book. But then I want to focus and drill down on one particular chapter that I think is especially relevant. As I've promoted this book, I've focused primarily on the March 31st, 1968 speech, which, looking at the audience, and no insult intended, but I have a feeling some of you may remember that. I don't want to insult anyone, but I talked to a number of people, and when I do that on March 31st, which is a very, I would argue, pivotal moment in American presidency, because if he does not resign, or say he's not going to run for re-election, Richard Nixon may not have won, Lyndon Johnson may, and maybe history was different from what we see today. So it's a pivotal moment. But tonight I chose a different one. And so what the book does is it covers a whole set of major issues. And the thing that I think is so good about it is not what I did, but the story itself, how it resonates today. I mean, you start off with the Pueblo Affair. I mean, the North Koreans have been screwing with us for a long time. Then you go into Tet and the centrality of the Vietnam War. I talk about the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. I talk about the Abe Fortas nomination, where the Republicans opposed Abe Fortas being promoted to the Chief Justice on the basis that Lyndon Johnson was a lame-duck president. Chicago. And finally, the part that I'm going to focus on tonight, I mean, there's so many other things. Czechoslovakia, the Soviet invasion. There's a lot there. And, I encourage you to buy the book. I have a son going off to college next year. And he's going to Southwestern, so it's not like he's going to a state school. So buy and buy often, to borrow Johnson's way of doing voting. Vote and vote often. Buy and buy often. So tonight, what I want to focus on is the Chennault Affair. How many saw the Rachel Maddow documentary called Betrayal? Oh, gosh. All right, I'm going to give you a homework assignment. When you leave, go watch it. One, I know part of it would be hard because you have to look at my face. But my chapter actually inspired this documentary on the Chennault Affair. And it's called Betrayal. It's an MSNBC documentary. And it's got a lot of good materials there. Joe Califano and others are included. But that's your homework. Okay? That's your homework. So let's talk about it. Early on the morning of October 29, 1968, Lyndon Johnson met with his national security advisors to discuss a bombing haul. And I don't think you can underestimate. These are two of the March 31st speech, which you will recognize. If I'd had a second cover to put on the book, it'd be that picture to the left, where he's with Robert McNamara and they're talking about Vietnam. Vietnam is front and center to Lyndon Johnson's presidency. It is front and center at the museum. And again, March 31st. What we see here is Johnson had throughout the summer, because if you remember, the main thing that he emphasized on the March 31st speech was he was going to devote his time to getting the United States out of Vietnam. He even went so far as to say to a friend after the speech, what I anticipate is no American troops will be left in Vietnam except those closing down the facilities when I leave office in January of 1969. We know that is not what occurs. And I'm going to try to explain part of the reason why. I'm trying not to be Beto, and do all my hands everywhere and things like that. Sometimes that's easier said than done. But I could be compared to others that are worse. After fierce debates, the president settled on pushing forward to try to jumpstart the peace negotiations with the North Vietnamese. As the morning came and the sun rose, Walt Rostow delivered a message from his brother Eugene. He reported receiving a call from a friend in New York, a prominent banker, Alexander Sachs. According to Sachs, he had just had lunch with several close associates of Richard Nixon, who reported Nixon was trying to frustrate the president by inciting Saigon to step up its demands. Johnson is infuriated. He growled and said he wanted to speak to the presidential candidates, including Nixon, at least by 5 p.m. Have a phone they can cram right up their butts, he tells his advisors. in true Johnson fashion. He would attack vigorously that late afternoon, especially directing his venom toward Nixon, who he resenting for having earlier called his peace plans a thinly disguised surrender. Such characterizations made LBJ declare that Nixon's statements were ugly and unfair, given by a man who distorts the history of his time. The tense phone call initiated a week where Johnson and his staff contemplated going public with the Nixon campaign's interference in the efforts to bring peace to Vietnam. But the machinations of the campaign had been ongoing for months. People inside the campaign had worked with Madam Anna Chennault, who you see standing between Kissinger and Nixon to the right, and Miss Anna Chennault. She's a prominent Republican fundraiser, the wife of Claire Chennault of the Flying Tigers fame. He knew they were working to undermine the peace process. They're afraid that if a peace plan goes through, that might help push Hubert Humphrey over the top. And this had already started even earlier. But this race had just continued, and the Nixon campaign had grown more desperate. If you look at the polling numbers, they're closing very much. He had a 20-something point lead coming out of the Democratic Convention in August, but it had been closing and closing quickly. Thus, on October 22nd, 1968, Nixon ordered his aide, H.R. Haldeman, to keep Chennault working on the SVN, South Vietnamese. He also asked, any other way to monkey wrench it? Anything Richard Nixon can do, or RN? He instructed him to use his personal secretary, Rosemary Woods, to contact a prominent businessman, a Chinese businessman, Louis Kung, to tell the South Vietnamese president, Nguyen Van Thu, to hold firm. The knowledge of this interference led Johnson to order a wiretap of the South Vietnamese embassy in Washington on October 29th. Keep in mind, they were already spying on the South Vietnamese presidential palace. They were already spying on our allies, already bugged that with the NSA. But now he requests round-the-clock surveillance of Madame Chennault. Building off plans, again, what had already been put in place in South Vietnam in the presidential palace. For days, FBI forwarded message about the phone calls related to the major components here, Bu Zim, the South Vietnamese ambassador to the United States, and to your right. So Joe Califano will note this about Johnson during this period. Johnson now suspected that Nixon had acted on Chennault's advice and treasonably, to his thinking, subverted his own government in order to win the election. Another aide remembered that Johnson, when he learned of the activities, declared, "This is treason." At several junctures, Johnson put Nixon on the spot. On July 31st, he delivered a strong message to the Republican nominee during a telephone call with all the candidates. He obliquely chastised Nixon by calling out the interference of the China lobby. And with a wicked grin noticed by several aides, he emphasized, "And I know that none of you candidates are aware of it or responsible for it." And again, in true Johnson fashion, he knew what he was saying. Soon after, he gave news of the interference by the Nixon campaign to Hubert Humphrey. However, the Democratic nominee hesitated to make it public. Despite the rich political capital it would have produced, he noted that he lacked definitive evidence and it would have been difficult to explain how we knew about what Chennault was doing. That's extremely important. But he still could have, and possibly should have, as one of his advisors said, 99 out of 100 men with the presidency on the line would have had no inhibitions. They would have demagogued it. Despite the interference, Johnson announced a bombing halt and outlined a planned start to renewed talks in Paris on November 6th. But the Nixon people continued their efforts as LBJ complained to an advisor, a campaign aide to Humphrey. "Nixon is in deep telling to, and all of them not to go on with me with anything." He continues and says that Tu thinks that we will sell him out, and Nixon has convinced him, and this damn little old woman, Miss Chennault, she's been in on it the whole time. So as the election neared, Members of Johnson's inner circle continued to debate how to respond. Some, like Secretary of State Dean Rusk, called for giving a press conference on the interference of the China lobby, which Richard Nixon had been tied to very closely when he was a senator and then in his time as vice president. But he wanted to stop short of naming names in the Nixon entourage. Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford and others in the White House also proposed applying the Logan Act to the Nixon campaign. Passed in 1799, it prohibited unauthorized Americans from negotiating with a country having a dispute with the United States. But here's the problem. And again, I never thought I'd learned that much about the Logan Act until I did this chapter, and then I've heard it echoed in the last 2 years. What the Logan Act, though, is the problem is it had only been applied twice in history. Once in 1802, once in 1852, and in neither case was a conviction secured. However, people inside of the White House thought about its application to the Nixon campaign, but nobody really went forward. I mean, they had before and thought about it. Nicholas Katzenbach had actually proposed using it against Stokely Carmichael for going to Cuba in 1967. But again, so close to the election and the lack of convictions made the people back off of that. But there were other encouraging. Others told Johnson to reach out to intermediaries to the Nixon people. The president agreed and called on Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen in open. We're skirting on dangerous grounds, and I thought I ought to give you the facts, and you ought to pass them on if you choose. If you don't, then I will a little later. He outlined how Chennault had just talked to her boss in New Mexico, who encouraged her to push to hold out until the election. Johnson emphasized to Dirksen, now I'm reading their hand, Everett. I don't want this to get into the campaign, and they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason. But here's something I think you have to understand what Johnson is going through at this time. He loves the presidency more than any person that I really think loved the office. He'd always wanted it. Never thought he would achieve it. But now he had it, and he really wanted to protect the institution. Especially because he knew there was a good chance Nixon was going to win, and if he blew the whistle to try to stop Nixon's meddling, and Nixon won, there are two major problems. One is he's going to be accused of partisanship and trying to throw the election to Humphrey. The second is if Nixon wins and he goes into office, and immediately a constitutional crisis could develop. He did not want that to happen to the presidency. So all these things are playing out. Johnson had sort of stayed to the sidelines. And Arnie Offer has just written a book on Hubert Humphrey, and he takes Johnson to task for not doing a better job of supporting Hubert Humphrey. But Johnson was looking at this, he was going to be like Dwight Eisenhower in 1960, try to stay above the fray and focus on the peace talks. But there's another thing that I think explains Johnson's hesitancy to go public with this. He would have to admit how he got the information. That's significant. We know that is a challenge for him because he had been using the FBI against the anti-war movement, CIA, there's all kinds of different things that we will learn more about in the church committee hearings. But Johnson would have to out his sources, and he would have to out that he had also been spying on his own allies. And he's hesitant to do so. But as he fumes, Dirksen delivered the message quickly. Not long after, Nixon called LBJ early on November 3rd, only 3 days before the election. And here are the major antagonists. John Mitchell had been running an operation basically since June of 1968 and meeting with Bouzem and Madame Chennault. Of course, Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon at the top of the ticket after August 1969. But here I love these two things, and I'm going to juxtapose in just a second. Nixon is going to deny that he or anyone with whom he's associated is working with Anna Chennault and working to undermine the peace process. To me, this picture, you want to see the third picture I would have selected to put on the front cover is the one to the right. I think that speaks volumes about how Johnson and Nixon interacted. I like the way the mirrors are in the background also. That is just a classic picture. So Dirksen delivers the message, but Nixon says, well, and what Johnson starts him off on, if you ever get a chance to listen to the tape, it's on the tape. And you can find this on the LBJ website, also on the Miller Center website. Just do LBJ Nixon, November 1968. It's classic. Johnson says to him early on, as a matter of fact, I am not privy to what you are doing, of course, which was a blatant lie by Johnson. But then Nixon responds and promises to support the president's effort. We got to get those South Vietnamese to Paris or you can't have peace. Johnson countered, well, I think that if you can take that position, you're on very, very sound ground. Then Nixon promised, I just want you to know I'm not trying to interfere with your conduct of it. I only want to do what Rusk wants me to do. But I'll do anything. And it concludes with Johnson, well, that's good, Dick. And soon the call ends. But we know, despite the assurances, many in the White House remain skeptical of Nixon. Johnson vacillated between wanting to protect the office and seeking to expose Nixon campaign's activities. And just to go back just a little bit when I said that Anna Chennault's boss was in New Mexico and was giving her orders, the only person who was in New Mexico that day was Spiro Agnew. And of course they used payphones, but they tapped all kinds of fun things. But they kept up these activities. One emphasized that John Mitchell, Nixon's campaign manager, called Chennault almost every day to push her to continue to try to persuade to and to staying away from Paris and preventing a breakthrough that might assist Humphrey. But Johnson did one last opportunity to make the issue public. In late October, a Christian Science Monitor reporter in South Vietnam highlighted that she had talked to South Vietnamese who were bragging about how the Republicans and how the Nixon campaign was seeking to effectively undermine the peace talks. But her editor said, we need more information. So on November 4th, her colleague, Savelle Davis, visited the South Vietnamese embassy where he questioned Ambassador Zim about the story. Ironically, an FBI bug picked up the conversation. And soon after, Wastow contacted the president about the brewing story. Soon after that, Davis asked for a White House response. So on November 4th, the last day to have any real impact on the election, Johnson's advisors discussed the matter. Ultimately, they concluded, led by Wastow, that even if the story breaks, it is judged too late to have a significant impact on the election. The viability of the man elected president was involved, as well as subsequent relations between him and President Johnson. Therefore, the common recommendation was that we should not encourage such stories and hold tight to the data we have. Reluctantly, Johnson concurred. And an administration spokesperson responded to Davis, obviously, I'm not going to get into this kind of thing in any way, shape, or form. And the story died. The following day, November 5th, the American people gave Nixon a narrow victory over Humphrey, as the Chennault Affair would remain in the shadow for years. However, some acknowledge its importance. A South Vietnamese official noted, we helped elect an American president. A cabinet minister in Thu's government observed, 15 days would have done it, but 4 days wasn't enough, and we saw to that. Despite Nixon's victory, the White House kept gathering intelligence on Chennault. As more information flowed in, even Wastow acknowledged, first reaction may have been wrong. But with this information, I think it's time to blow the whistle on these folks. But LBJ refused to tarnish the new president-elect. It was too late, and he knew it. The surveillance of Chennault continued through mid-December, and the wiretap for another month on the South Vietnamese embassy in Washington. And it is ironic, at this point, Johnson tries to hide the whole affair from public purview. He had Wastow gather all the materials in one file, ironically named the X-File. He had them take the documents with him when he left the White House. In 1973, on LBJ's death, Wastow ceded the documents to the president's new library to be released 50 years later, in 2023. However, Harry Middleton, the library, chose to release the documents in 1994. And you can go online and find these X-File documents. and reach your own conclusion. Despite Johnson and Rostow's efforts, the story continued to circle around in a series of stories by Tom Auten of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch into the early 1970s. Nixon had an aide, Tom Houston, do a detailed report of the FBI files in February of 1970. Nixon would follow up by ordering the break-in of the Brookings Institution in June of 1971 because he thought the organization had a record of the affair. It led to the creation of a group called the Plumbers, who later won quite a bit of notoriety. Ultimately, Johnson, and this is down on the ranch after the presidency, Johnson did not live long enough to see the Watergate scandal unfold. That would severely damage the office of the presidency, fulfilling what he had feared would happen if he released the information on Chennault and the Nixon campaign. He had remained cautious throughout, fearful of exposing his sources, and also maintaining some doubt on the actual culpability of Nixon, as well as fearful of appearing overly partisan. No one will know for sure what he would have thought after Watergate broke. But he would likely have understood it tied to Chennault and the campaign's activities, and that he may have missed an opportunity to save the country a great deal of heartache. Thank you very much.
Okay. As always, we have time for questions. If you wouldn't mind, we've got microphones coming through both aisles. Please wait for the mic so we can record your thoughts for posterity. And Professor Longley will
gladly take
field
questions.
his own question.
Yes. So who's up first? All right, here's one.
At the beginning of your talk, you used the sentence, "The North Vietnamese were screwing with us." Could you go into some detail about what you meant by that?
Yeah, they were going back and forth. They had been since, if you know, in April of 1968, they had reached out to us and started talking about peace negotiations. They had gone in May to Paris. Cyrus Vance was our head official, and they had sort of strung things out. So had we, both sides. And this is the hard part for Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson would do this the whole time in 1968. Some days he'd want to go back to bombing the hell out of them. Other days he wants to seek peace. Well, the North Vietnamese were trying to work the best deal possible, what they thought was best for them. So they were messing, we get in fights over who's going to lead the talks, how they're going to be played out. So both sides are playing games. So don't take me that I don't think both sides. And again, Lyndon Johnson, sometimes it depended on who he was listening to last. If he was listening to Walt Rostow, he was hawkish. If he was listening to Clark Clifford, he tended to be more dovish. So, but it's up and down. Some days, like I say, it could change day to day. Great question. Other questions? That or I gave the best talk in whole history. Yeah, I know you. You better give me a good one. He's my co-author in that military history.
Do you think that LBJ's handling of the Chennault Affair, that kind of paved the way for the scandal of the Nixon presidency?
A lot of people make that argument. Again, if you look at the break-in of the Brookings Institution in 1971, how it led to the creation of the Plumbers, I definitely think there's a tie. But it also, I think, is a tie because it establishes precedents of how they're going to behave. And I think that's extremely important to keep in mind. Those arguments have been made time and time again because when I was promoting this book, it came out last February. And when I was promoting the book, always I got the question, how is this similar to today? And I am going to be interested in, well, if we ever get to see the documents, how Obama and his advisors were dealing with this same basic issue in their mind. Now, we don't know that for sure. But you have to be asking yourself that question. I mean, they asked me, was 68 just like 2018? I said, thank God, no, not yet. We haven't had assassinations. We don't have people in the streets rioting and burning down D.C. and Chicago. We have, the Democratic Convention, all the different things that 68, which Johnson called a year of a continuous nightmare, which I think summed it up quite well. I mean, you and I were a little young for that, but I still, my parents have talked about it enough. That year was hellish. And knock on wood, we don't repeat it again. But I do think, of course. And you got Spiro Agnew, and we know what Spiro Agnew was even doing before he got into the vice presidency. So I think these things they're establishing some precedents, and the same actors, John Mitchell and others, reappear. Somebody here. Yes, ma'am. If you'll. Well, they want to catch it on the film. I have one too. I really don't need this mic.
You mentioned that Lyndon Johnson's and his decisions were just gravitating, but isn't that true of any president that gets there? They have advisors of conflicting opinions, so depending who they listen to.
Yeah.
So does that mean that after they hear everything, then we have to have a strong president of the capability of making his decisions? But then where does Congress come in, especially in war situations?
That's a wonderful question. And I teach the Vietnam War class once a year. And I'm always getting the question, why are you still teaching the Vietnam War class? And it's because students come into the classroom wanting to try to understand this conflict. And if anything, it's intensified since the Iraq-Afghanistan war. My younger students, I've had many come in, and later I'll tell you a fun story on that. But Johnson's arsenic is Vietnam. Now, when it came to voting rights and civil rights, he pushed through, and he knew what his goal was, and he knew how. Now, he didn't have that same confidence in foreign policy. And he relied heavily on Kennedy's people. Partly, I think, because he does lack confidence. He doesn't have that prestigious education. He doesn't have that background. And I think we see a number of presidents come. Bill Clinton, I think, had the same basic issues arise till the end of his presidency, that foreign policy is not really what he wanted to focus on. He wanted to focus on health care and domestic issues. But I think that's always the case. But Johnson, with Vietnam, from 1963 forward, he couldn't make up his mind. And it cost him the greatness of his presidency. I mean, you go to the Johnson Library, and the first thing that you notice is all the pens lining the wall. 400 pieces of legislation signed in 5 years. Major pieces of legislation. But what do most people come into the library thinking about? Vietnam. So it is the arsenic. And I think on Vietnam, now, you read the book and how well he handled Pueblo affair. I think he did a splendid job. Now, if he'd wanted to make a point, he could have bombed North Korea and got the 82 Americans killed. But he was patient. He did the same on the assassinations of King, and he could have ordered the troops in and started slaughtering people in the cities. He chose not to. He chose to tell them restraint. But Vietnam, he could never, ever get his head wrapped around it. And to tell you the truth, it wasn't a war he wanted. I mean, I always still like to use two things that I like to say to my students about Lyndon Johnson on Vietnam. He always talked about feeling like he was a Texas farmer, caught in a hailstorm, and no place to run, no place to hide. The other one that I always like to tell the students, he liked to say he felt like he was a catfish. And he was looking at a worm, and he knew it was on a hook, but he just couldn't help biting into it. And he never could figure it out. And Vietnam, again, drove him into an early grave. Great question. Yes, ma'am. And I'll get around. I'm sorry, I'm focused here.
Should Congress amend the Logan Act to make it more clear?
I would say yes.
How?
They're going to have to write it in a very different way. The Logan Act was very broad and ambiguous. And you would have to write it. And here's the point I should have made earlier. I do not think, like Johnson, that Nixon committed treason. And the reason I'll read you how you define treason. Treason of the United States shall consist only in the levying war against them or adhering to the enemy, giving them aid and comfort. Well, there's something major missing there. Nixon and his associates are actively collaborating with an ally. Now, if this had been the North Vietnamese or if it had been the Soviets, slam dunk. But I don't think it rises. So it would have to take something to that order to rewrite about the act of collusion or collaboration between a candidate or an American citizen working to undermine, say, the electoral process. I think you would have to write it and be very, very specific. And that's going to be difficult because you're going to have people say, well, no, you can't restrain people that way. Plus, how are you going to prove it? See, that's going to be the part of the Obama question. What did they have and when did they have it? Maybe they didn't. Maybe Johnson always still was a little hesitant. He thought Richard Nixon was involved. He knew the administration or his campaign was involved, but he didn't have that direct tie. And until recently, this newer document that came out that H.R. Haldeman said about what I read about on October 22nd, that's been as close to a smoking gun as we've gotten. So it would take Congress to really have to think about this. And then what happens if they go overboard? That you can't even talk to the Israelis, or how do we? Are the Russians our enemy? How do you define enemy? You have to be in an active state of war. And that's why I say I don't think this rises to meet the standard of treason, because they were actively collaborating with an ally. Is it unethical? Absolutely. Did it help contribute to 25,000 more American deaths and millions in Cambodia, Laos, and South Vietnam? Probably. But this is what we as historians get paid the big bucks for, is to find these materials and bring them out and let you make your decision on it. How does this fit? But again, I would argue it does not fit the definition of treason. Well, that's... Is unethical acceptable? What do we get? Well, now that I'm out of government service, I can do that. Yeah, so maybe I will. Jeff and I will work on something, okay? Well, I shouldn't throw you in. You may not want any part of that. So we'll see. Okay, next question. Yes, here and then here. Okay, yes, sir.
Could you give us a take on the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, please?
Yes. As a historian of the Vietnam War, and, well, let me qualify that. I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none. I've written 2 books on U.S. Latin American relations. I wrote a book on Albert Gore Sr. I've written 2 books on Reagan. I've written 2 books on combat soldiers in Vietnam. This book, the military history. So I'm all over the place. But I do teach the Vietnam War extensively. And I think the Gulf of Tonkin, it is very apparent by contemporary documents the first attack occurred. The second one, unlikely. But as someone has made the very good point, I may have been Fred Logerval, they were primed and ready for a reason. So I do believe they didn't wait, they didn't clarify, and there were people in the White House, including people like Rothschild, who till his dying day was hawkish. And so that question of were we led into war on bad information, I think is unequivocally true. That's just that's pretty close. I don't know if hardly anybody argued to the contrary on that. How far Johnson went, how much of this was intelligence provided him that was wrong, how much people were just primed and ready to go. The other good documentary that I can recommend is a documentary I worked on called On Two Fronts, on Latinos in Vietnam. And a significant portion of that documentary focuses on Everett Alvarez, who after the Gulf of Tonkin, he was one of the bombers, people bombing the harbor, and got shot down and then served the rest of the time in a North Vietnamese prison of war camp. It's a fascinating story in its own right. His sister became an anti-war protester, and it's taken a long time for them to reconcile that. But I don't have any doubt. There were multiple layers to this, but no way no one can say that that second attack occurred. Back here. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. It seems that these jobs in public service, particularly with our views of the presidency, they require an adherence to unwritten rules, the honor system, that kind of thing. Yeah. So what happens, and you spoke of LBJ and Nixon, and we have even the McCain and the recent president kind of back and forth, even though he's dead, and all that.
Yeah.
But what happens when, or who generally wins when you have a person who follows these unwritten rules of honor and they are going against somebody who doesn't care about that?
Jeff, do you think I can answer this?
And also the propriety of
I can answer this?
the propriety of a president choosing to not give information because it may make the office look bad or
Right.
his legacy look bad. And how honorable, or is that it's their choice because they're in that office, but this whole idea of honor winning or losing over dishonor, or these rules, because you can't have a rule for everything.
Right.
So these offices have to be manned or womaned by people with honor. And when that doesn't happen, which side tends to win?
Well, I'm going to speak from some personal experience recently, and I will argue that the person who is dishonorable that will take the shortcuts will win almost every time. Almost every time. But, as I told my son recently on this same basic question, sometimes you do the right thing and you suffer the consequences. And for that, I will never apologize. Now, that's my personal moral center. And I was raised like that by a Texas football coach that I watched many times. Others would take shortcuts to improve their team, and he would refuse to do so. And he paid a price sometimes for that, because you know there's only two types of coaches in Texas, right? Those that have been fired, those are going to get fired. So he was one of those. But I think if you look at these things, but here's the point. And here's the thing I told my son recently on this, my 14-year-old, as he was crying about something. I said, eventually it does catch up with you. The morality that caught up with Richard Nixon started here in the Chennault Affair, and it carried forth to Watergate. And we know Richard Nixon is discredited. But in the immediate short term, he won. And he won the presidency. He won what he'd wanted for so long. So I would argue, just looking at this, typically the ones that will, the unscrupulous ones, they're going to win in the short term. So that is a choice. And some people, and Jeff probably can answer this better than I because he's focused on issues like impeachment. So would you add?
I'm not touching impeachment on this one.
No. Did I answer that?
Yes, and my fear is at what cost?
Oh, that's
We pay in now, and history makes them pay later when they're dead.
well, again, it only took 5 years before Richard Nixon paid, or 6 years before Richard Nixon paid an ultimate price. Now, he didn't suffer completely, but leaving on the helicopter and doing this as you leave, that's pretty substantial. And you're discredited to a large degree. Does it always catch up with people? Absolutely not. We know that is not always the case. But as I tell my sons, when it comes down, when you put your head on the pillow at night, did you do the right thing? And I tell them integrity is this. It is doing the right thing when nobody's watching. And you can tell where I sort of come at this from, and that's why I probably won't make a good politician. Yes, Jeff?
Well, let me make an observation and then ask you a deeper Vietnam question. But the observation is, I think that the morality question and the virtue question, it really falls, to my mind, on Johnson. I mean, I think you can make an equal case that he is acting in the nation's best interest and therefore presidential and upholding the duty of his office by going public or not. And I think it's a real testament to where he may know what the right thing to do is today or even tomorrow, but he also has to think the broader picture, and of course, the side he falls on leaves the nation to other problems. Yeah. So the question I want to ask actually dovetails from that for Vietnam. That you made the point, and you're describing Johnson's approach to Vietnam, that he was not able to make a decision, that he was not able necessarily to get his arms around or his mind around this problem. And I think it's almost axiomatic at this point for historians to look back on Johnson's overall approach to Vietnam and see it as not only a failure but a tragedy. The problem I have with that is I find it very difficult to pinpoint precisely which moment Johnson made the wrong decision. Because, as Fred Logevall tried to do this, obviously, in the spring of '65.
Right.
But at what point do you look at Johnson and say, you as a person who teaches Vietnam, and say, that's the moment that the decision was wrong? Because I could argue that even though the overall policy turned out tragically, every single strategic decision was the right decision for that moment.
I do not disagree with that at all. I don't think there is a a turning point. I don't agree. I think it's incremental. And the other thing I think that's a problem with all of this is blaming Johnson exclusively for it. You got to throw Rostow in there. You got to throw Westmoreland in there. You got to throw Earl Wheeler in there. I mean, we've got a lot of people that are influencing the policy and pushing him in certain directions. Now, yeah, the ultimate buck stops here, but there's a lot, and I don't see a moment. I can tell you when I really think he turned on the war and finally made a decision. Keep in mind, in the Tet Offensive, right after that, Westmoreland and Wheeler come to him and ask for 206,000 more troops, in addition to the 558,000 that are already there. The moment the wise men pull out on him in late March 1968 is the moment that I think he finally says, enough. He gives Westmoreland about 40,000, but those are basically just replacement troops. So I can pinpoint that at the wise men and definitely by the March 31st speech. So there's about a 4-day period there. But as far as the incremental move toward war, I mean, he's criticized by many people for not turning the military loose. But in Johnson's defense, did we want another war with China? Did we want another, what could it have triggered? That great statement by Johnson, my greatest fear is this. Some pilot from Johnson City, Texas, is going to drop a bomb down the smokestack of a Russian trawler with the Soviet ambassador on it, igniting World War III. This was difficult. And he didn't. How many people spoke up to him? George Ball is about the only one in that early stage. Nobody else. So I don't think you pin it on Johnson. And I think it's bureaucratic. The military has their own viewpoints. There are people within the military that are raising questions.
So let me ask a follow-on.
Yes.
I've got the mic and I don't have to relinquish it.
And you're the boss.
That's also a good point. So just like I'm the Lyndon Johnson. I'm just curious, as a person who has taught Vietnam and thought about Vietnam for so long and studied under one of the great Vietnam historians, if not the greatest Vietnam historian.
Oh, no, George is that.
Let me give you this hypothetical or this counterfactual.
Yeah.
That I could make the argument that Vietnam is not a tragedy. Vietnam is a strategic loss. That in fact, if one had not gone through the process, this is not what I believe, this is just the argument, if one had gone through the process of Vietnam differently, destroyed American credibility by pulling out, or perhaps not put American credibility on the line in the first place, that 1989 turns out differently.
Good.
That this Vietnam, however terrible it is, well, I'll use a football analogy in light of your father, is the quarterback eating the ball and taking a sack.
Right.
But the drive continues.
Well, we've heard this from I forget his name, the Singapore president, that Vietnam bought democracies in Southeast Asia time because the preoccupation in Russia and China was with Vietnam and bought them time to be able to solidify their own bases. I've heard that argument. Of course, as historians, counterfactuals, we always tend to try to avoid. But it is a question. I mean, it's the same thing, like I said, I made the point. What if Lyndon Johnson stays in the race? And the polling show he probably would have won, even through August, September of 1968. Hubert Humphrey got close, and Hubert Humphrey couldn't carry anybody in the South. Lyndon Johnson would have held on to some of the South. George Wallace was cutting in, but he was cutting into Nixon also. What would have happened? How would it have changed? Would Johnson have continued this path of trying to seek peace? And would he have been successful? And the answer is always, we don't know.
Well, okay, so I'm going to hand the mic over in just one second.
Okay, yeah.
We're old friends, which means
Yes.
I can ask you this question.
Yes.
I asked you a question, and you answered my question by saying, that's a really interesting question.
Oh, you've been in a graduate seminar before and done the same thing.
So I'm putting you on the spot.
Okay, I'll say it. I don't know. That is one thing is, when you've been 25 years in the teaching, that's one of the smartest things you learn always to say. I don't know, I'll find out. And the next time next time I come back up, I'll have an answer. Maybe, yeah, that's good.
Thank you for a good talk.
Here and then here.
Let me ask you, between Reagan and Bush, did they have anything to do with the hostages and Carter delaying the hostages? And was that just as bad as what Nixon did?
We don't have any proof on that. Jeff probably can talk to you better about that because he's done more work in the Bush. But there was that speculation that William Casey was overseas, but I've never seen anything substantial and never seen any kind of paper trail on that. But it's always this fundamental idea of the October surprise. You know, and you always wonder what the October surprise is going to be. Yeah. So the answer to in my opinion is we have not seen anything to ever support that. Yeah. Well, yeah. But I think Jeff's done more work on this than I, and I don't tend to think that that was the case. But again, things can always change. Maybe there's an X-file floating out there that we don't know about. It's coming. I know there was somebody else. Yes, sir. Yeah. See if that'll turn on for you. I can hear you, but I'll try to repeat the question.
In 1960, one of the issues Kennedy and Johnson ran along was the missile gap. Eisenhower knew from intelligence that the missile gap was in favor of us versus the Russians, but he didn't say anything because they would have had to reveal intelligence.
Right.
I don't know if Kennedy's people knew that it was a lie, that if they knew that there was no missile gap.
Right.
There clearly was an analogous. It would have helped Nixon significantly, and yet Eisenhower felt like insane.
Right. Well, I think it goes to this same question you just raised. He was saying about the 1960 election, if Eisenhower had spoke out forcefully that there was no missile gap, would that have helped Nixon? Probably. But also keep in mind, throughout the whole election, he had basically taken a position of neutrality. Part of that was he didn't like Richard Nixon. There's just a reality there. I mean, one of my favorite stories to tell about Richard Nixon is when he went to Caracas in 1958 during his goodwill trip to Latin America and watching Venezuela right now. He's going between the airport and downtown, and mobs surround him and start beating, and one of his Secret Service guys draws the gun, and he's about to go outside and start shooting, and Nixon stops him because he realized what would come next. But the irony of that is they had to make plans to extricate Nixon out of Caracas. You know what they named the operation? Operation Poor Richard. So there is not a lot of... And so some have tried to say this was how Johnson and Humphrey. I think that's overly stating that. I do think Johnson wanted to follow Eisenhower's and try to maintain some neutrality. But I also know Johnson at times could be very petty. And I'll tell you the saddest part of this book. On his birthday in 1968 in August, the Democratic National Convention's going on. And he's sitting at his ranch in Johnson City or Stonewall and waiting. He thinks they're going to call him to come up and save the day. Now, his aides have argued he wouldn't have accepted the nomination, but he wanted to be asked. And when they don't ask him, it's one of the saddest moments, I think, in Lyndon Johnson's life. When he has to tell the pilot, let the plane go, we've got to go to Austin to Lucy's to have a birthday party. So there's a lot of things at play here. Did Lyndon Johnson harangue Hubert Humphrey at times? Yeah. He did that to everybody. But I don't think he had the animosity toward Hubert Humphrey that Eisenhower had towards Nixon. I don't see that. I think there was genuine respect at times. But Humphrey just didn't fit Johnson's concept of masculinity in many ways. He cried too often. And Nixon in some ways fit it better because he was pugnacious, rose up, raised himself by his bootstraps. There were some commonalities there. But yeah, again, you don't know. And that's when I drive my engineering students crazy. It's because they want a black-white answer. History doesn't give you those a lot of times. There's a lot of gray. Great question. Let's come back here and then, because you'd already had one, and let me get to someone that hadn't. No, that's, well, I have to be nice here because I am by training a diplomatic historian. I do not see that. If that was the case, the United States pulls out in 1973. 18 months later, the Vietnamese, South Vietnam falls. They had the 5th largest air force in the world when we left. There's a lot of things that I would challenge that assumption on, that we were within 2 months. We were never within 2 months of winning, period. You know, these guys had fought wars against the Chinese for 1,000 years. They would have fought us for a lot longer. They had an ideology that said ultimately they were going to win. So I always find these what we call revisionist interpretations of the Vietnam War. We could have won if we'd done A, B, C, D, and E. Well, of course, we can't test that fully because it just didn't happen. But I find things like that, I just don't agree with it. I don't think there's any proof to support that assumption. Again, you read the North Vietnamese, read a wonderful book called Hanoi's War by Hang Nguyen, and she's done it in the North Vietnamese. They weren't at any point ready to give up. Would they retreat? Would they stand bound and wait it out? Absolutely. But were they ever going to quit? No. Let's come here and then, here, yes.
Did you watch Ken Burns?
Yes.
Give us an opinion. Did you watch Ken Burns?
I did watch Ken Burns. My opinion is this, and I wrote a good article in Diplomatic History about my critiques of the Ken Burns. Here's what I'm going to say first. Anytime something comes along that makes people want to learn more, 2 thumbs up. I thought there were a number of things that bothered me about it. And I'm going to give you the one that bothered me, 2 things that bothered me most. One is the people he interviewed as soldiers' statements. All those people tended to be very well educated or became well educated. They weren't the people that I studied in my book, Grunts or the Morenci Marines. The guys I studied were truck drivers, farmers. None of those were represented. They were Carl Melantis, well educated. Tim O'Brien, who I loved him, but college degree. Even the African American had come back, the one basically, and earned a PhD. So I found that sort of troubling in my own way, that the voices of the guys that really did a lot of the fighting on the front lines weren't represented to the same degree that I've tried to do in my other works. The other is, I thought he still doesn't get it. He still does not get it. He still looks at race between a black-white prism, which a lot of people do. But the voices, he gave Native Americans one little section, a little sliver to Latinos, and I just didn't think he did. Again, it goes back to representation. Whose voices did he choose? Most of them were from Northeast or Northwest. They weren't from the South. They weren't from the Southwest. They weren't, again, Latino. There was a lot of that missing. But in 14 hours, and documentary filmmakers are different from historians. They can only do so much, and they are doing it in a different manner. And he did encourage a younger generation to want to learn more about the Vietnam War, and for that, I applaud him. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Kyle, question. There's been a lot of discussion on whether or not, it's kind of factual, if Kennedy had lived, he would have pulled out of Vietnam. In your research, what's your answer to that question?
My normal answer to my students is this: no. It's pretty simple. Same advisors that moved in with Johnson were there. Now, I know he gives that Cronkite interview. I mean, there's levels to this. Where I think they would be better off making the argument is, would he have escalated to the degree that Johnson would have? I think that would have been a better question. But would Kennedy have withdrawn? I don't think so, especially not leading into the 1964 election, and especially if he was running against Barry Goldwater. The Democrats in 1950 took a beating over Korea and over the fall of China. That was strongly embedded into the Democratic mindset throughout the Cold War, that they were soft on communists. So I just don't think, we're digressing from here, but that's fine. I never have any problems with that. But that's usually how I say, 1, it's a counterfactual. We can't prove one way or the other. 2, if I were to speculate, just like I need to come back to Jeff's question after I've thought about it a little bit more, I would say no. Again, I just don't see the bureaucracy's the same. The advisors are the same. What's different, really? And if Goldwater's the nominee, what changes? Now, if it's Nelson Rockefeller's the nominee, that might have changed some of the dynamic. But that would have changed it for Lyndon Johnson also. Okay? Yes, sir.
I may be looking at this with 20/20 hindsight, but it seems to me that the war, in essence, was A, civil war, and B, a war where outside the large cities, the Americans were not wanted. If that, in fact, is true, why doesn't that message or messages apply to Afghanistan?
I'm going to give you a great story. And I'm going to digress a little bit because I'm a Texan and you know we love our big stories. In spring of 2017, I was teaching a course on guerrilla wars. I had a student come in. So the first day there are like 25 of them. They're lined up around the table. And so I'm trying to ascertain what do they know. And you sometimes worry they don't know a lot. Actually, this group was pretty good. And in fact, this one young man started articulating this beautiful argument. He goes, in this book that I read, it said the key to fighting in a war like Vietnam or Afghanistan is that you must learn to dehumanize the enemy. And he goes off, well, yeah, in this book, Grunts, that I read when I was in Afghanistan and as a Marine, the author was making this argument. I looked at him and I let him go for a little bit. And I go, well, what was the name of the author? He looked at me and goes, I don't remember. I said, what color was the book? Green. Some of the students in the class had read the book and they start snickering. It was my book. And I cut him some slack. I said, well, you know, the author's name was Longley. And you could see him sort of flush, but then he responded very quickly. He goes, well, Dr. Longley, I was in a foxhole or in a forward fire base being shot at most of the time I was in Afghanistan. Will you cut me some slack? And I said, that's the best damn excuse I've ever heard. But I'm going to a point. There are a lot of similarities. And this is what this young man was trying to do when he picks this book up out of nowhere and takes it with him to Afghanistan and then ends up in my classroom and doesn't put two and two together. He was trying to understand what it was like in Vietnam, where it was difficult to identify the enemy. It was difficult a lot of different ways. And there are many similarities, but there are also significant differences. Tribal in Afghanistan, it's very different in Vietnam. There are tribal natures of it, Hmongs and Montagnards. So I think you always have to be careful of trying to impose one particular model onto the next. And so I would say, yes, there are similarities that we probably should have learned our lessons from. But Americans do not learn their history very well.
Those who ignore history tend to relive it.
Yeah. You know, my favorite Steele statement on history is, life must be lived forward, but it can only be understood backwards. But how often do we understand it backwards? You know. And the great thing is, I was talking with your dean today here at SMU today. Your majors in the humanities are staying high. And that is a testament to the quality both of the staff and wonderful department chairs. And it also is a testament that these young people are coming in and not feeling like they have to be forced into STEM or to a practical, which many times you would see it like Arizona State, because 40% of all ASU students are first generation. So their parents don't want them majoring in the humanities. But that leads to a dearth of knowledge and a dearth of understanding of what we're going to progress. But the dean made a very important point today to me. He said Merrill Lynch had just come in and said, I want to know who your majors are. And I want to recruit them. He goes, we're not the business school. He goes, I don't care. I can train somebody to be a business person. I need people who can write and learn and read and synthesize and critically analyze. That's what we need in our world today, and we're not getting it. I should probably get off my soapbox now. Thank you.
So if you would, please follow your applause by taking out your checkbooks to Dedman College.
Yes, I support that wholeheartedly.
All joking aside, thank you. This has been a fascinating topic, and I think anything that involves Johnson is important to us, and you've eloquently described one of the critical and difficult decisions of his life. I think it's always important to note, or at least it's important to note this particular week, as we think about the United States and its experience in the second longest war that it ever endured, the war in Vietnam, that here we are 40-odd years later, and when the President of the United States needs a strategic ally in the world to go meet with a North Korean despot, Vietnam seems a reasonable place. So
We had to get there at some point.
That's right. So if you'll please join me now once more thanking Kyle. And
Thank you. Thanks, Bob.
And thank you for not telling him the score of the game.
Yes, I'll look it up very quickly. Thank you all. Are we? Good.